And good morning, good morning, good morning. How's everybody doing today? It's Dr. Roddenberry coming to you from Willow Springs, North Carolina. Again, the days are getting a little bit chillier, aren't they? I think fall is really here. Hello, April. How you doing? Jordan, good to see you. Yanan, good to see you as well. Looks like we got a pretty decent crowd this morning. Christine Marie, wow, good to see you. Thanks for coming today. Glad to have you. Glad to have you. Anybody else want to check in on the chat bar? If you're here this morning, send me a hello. Christine likes the weather. Okay, so you're kind of a fall weather fan, are you, Christine? I don't mind it too. I just don't want the really super cold weather, you know? But it certainly is football and fall and all that other fun stuff, right? Everybody going trick-or-treating this weekend? Or is it this weekend? It's next weekend, right? I'm glad to have you. John loves cold weather. Okay, cool. All right. I'm a cold weather chicken, but that's okay. Good deal. I hope everybody's doing well. Don't forget, the exam is this weekend. Exam number 2 covers chapters 5, 6, 7, and 8. And the exam is going to open tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. And it will be due Sunday night at 11:59 p.m. Okay? And don't forget your discussion boards also due today. And we have a webinar at 8 p.m. Christine Marie is from upstate New York. Ooh, okay. Where are you? Where in upstate New York are you from, Christine? I've been I go to out near the Buffalo area every summer because it's wonderful. Good morning, Suha. It's good to see you. We're just talking about the cold weather. Looks like I have a bunch of penguins in my class. Everybody loves the cold weather. Christine's from near the Syracuse area. Okay. So Christine just kind of likes fall. She doesn't like it too cold. She doesn't like it too hot. You know what? I think that's probably me too. You know what? I messed up bringing my green coffee cup today because you can't see it on the green screen. I got to keep that in mind. Cato, New York. You know, people don't realize how rural New York is. Everybody thinks about New York and all we think about is the big city. But that's a very small part of New York, isn't it, Christine? In fact, a lot of New York is cow towns, if you will. You know, it's a pretty rural state, I would say. Suha's not into cold weather, right? I don't blame you. All right, but fall's here. Has anybody gone to the state fair so far this year? Do we have any state fair people so far? Joke about cow tipping, yes. Anybody go to the state fair? How's the state fair this year? Is it packed? Were the rides any good? Anybody get any fried Snickers bars? Definitely a good part. Yes, been to the fair for the first time since moving here in 2012. Wow, Christine, it was pretty busy. Right. It gets that way. Okay. All right. Well, let's go ahead and get started with today's lecture. Oh my goodness. There we go. All right. So today we're going to talk a little bit about evaluating IQ tests. Okay. And then we're going to talk about ethnic differences in IQ tests, and then we're going to talk about newer forms of IQ tests, or newer forms of thinking about intelligence. Whoa, there we go. All right, so let's go ahead and get started if we can. All right, now here's the deal. You may or may not know this. I mentioned it in last night's webinars. IQ tests are everywhere. They rule your life. You don't even know it. But IQ and other aptitude tests rule your world. Oh, by the way, does anybody remember what an aptitude test is? How is an aptitude test different from an achievement test? And I'll wait for the answer in the chat bar here. Okay. Okay. Ask a question optional. Okay, good enough. So, how many of you remember what an aptitude test was? An aptitude test is measurement of how quickly you can learn. And you folks probably don't know this, but IQ test, there you go, your learning ability. Very good, Christine. Awesome, awesome, awesome. IQ tests hold a lot of power in our society. Remember, I told you that everybody takes IQ tests in third grade. They can really change your educational path. They can determine whether or not you go into gifted education or whether or not you get an IEP and go into some sort of special education program. They can affect your legal standing. IQ tests are used in court to determine the severity of your sentencing. In fact, IQ tests can even determine whether or not you are eligible for the death penalty. IQ tests are important sometimes in hiring decisions, and they're also used as part of the clinical diagnosis process. IQ tests are super duper important. Now, IQ tests, as I said down here, they are measurement tools, and it is important that they make accurate measurements, because if we're basing jobs, legal standing, academic status on IQ tests, you know what? They better be good at measuring what they are supposed to measure. And you know what? Just like a ruler is a tool that measures length, and a bathroom scale is a tool that measures weight, an IQ test and any other psychological instrument measures some sort of mental quality. And remember, I've mentioned this a couple of times this semester. There are people who argue about how accurately we are able to measure mental states. And so the question of how accurate and reliable IQ tests are is a question that is continually asked and evaluated. I want to introduce another type of psychologist to you today. It's called a psychometrician. A psychometrician. Psycho is mind, metrician, metric, measurement. So a psychometrician is somebody who specializes in measuring the mind. And these are the people who get the statistical and psych degrees, and they get the quantitative psych degrees. And these are the people who spend their time evaluating psychology tests and other mental measurement instruments to determine how accurate they are. It's their job to help us develop the best kinds of instruments for measuring human mental capabilities. And if you've ever been to the clinical psychologist and had your personality measured, if you've ever taken an IQ test or an SAT test, I guarantee you a psychometrician has been involved in the development of that instrument. Now, when we talk about psychological instruments, when we talk about psychometric instruments, we talk about two properties of these psychometric instruments. And if you think about it, these properties are useful for thinking about any measurement tool. And these properties are reliability and validity. Okay? Reliability is the degree to which the tool gives you the same measurement every time you measure the same thing. So think about it. If I had a tape measure and I measure the length of a table, that tape measure should give me the same measurement every time I measure that same table, right? If I use a tape measure to measure my height, and I measure my height 6 times today, that measurement tool should give me the same measurement every time. Imagine if I had a bathroom scale. I jumped on it and it said 135. And then I got off and I jumped on it again and it said 185. And then I jumped off of it and jumped back on again and it said I weighed 45 pounds. I've weighed myself 3 times. It said I was 135, 185, and 140 and 45 pounds. Is that bathroom scale any use to me? Is that bathroom scale any use to me at all? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. It is unreliable. And so unreliability really impairs the utility of a measurement tool. And for the same reason, we expect IQ tests and other intellectual measurement tools to give us the same measurements every time we measure the same thing. So if I test your IQ today and I test it in 3 months, okay, unless somehow or another they downloaded a bunch of stuff into your brain, it should give me the same measurement. If I measure your personality today and next week, that test should tell me that your personality is similar both times. If it doesn't, then I might make the guess that that tool is unreliable. Okay? Now, the second property of a test is validity, or what we might think of as accuracy. Does the tool measure what it is intended to measure? Does it measure it accurately? Now, here's the thing. If I weigh, I've actually lost a bunch of weight last year, and I'm down to 150, which is pretty skinny for a fellow my size. I weigh 150. Let's say I jumped on a bathroom scale and it said I weighed 130. And then I get off that bathroom scale and I jump on it again and it says I weigh 130. And then I get off that bathroom scale and I jump on it again and it says I weigh 130. You know what? That bathroom scale is very, very reliable. It's given me the same measurement every time. However, it's not giving me a valid measurement. It's giving me an inaccurate measurement. Now, I would argue that this scale is a little bit better than the unreliable one, okay? Because I can at least, if I gain a bunch of weight and I jump on it and it says 150 pounds and I measure it 3 times and it says 150 pounds. Now I may know it's not accurate, but I can at least tell how much my weight is changed, right? Because it's still giving me a reliable measure, but it's not giving me a valid measure. Now, there's a little bit bigger problem with mental measurement tests because sometimes we're not even sure that we're measuring the right thing. Am I measuring your reading ability instead of your IQ? Am I measuring your math ability instead of your IQ? You know what? Maybe it takes patience and focus to measure, to take an IQ test. So maybe a high score in an IQ test just says you're a more focused person than somebody who scores low. So the problem with psychometric tests is we're often not sure that they're actually measuring the intellectual quality that we want them to measure. So one of the 2 biggest questions that we have about IQ tests is, are they reliable indicators of some sort of quality? And do they measure that thing we think they measure? Now, what I'd like to do is talk about ways of evaluating how we have evaluated IQ tests to determine these qualities. Now, I would tell you that IQ tests are fairly reliable indicators, and your IQ score is not going to change much starting at about the age of 4. You may not believe this, but IQ scores become very reliable at the age of 4. We can't even reliably measure personality at the age of 4. We can't reliably measure personality until your late teens. But IQ tests tend to give the same measurement of IQ starting at around the age of 4. Now, how do we test IQ tests? Well, one way is to give the same person the same test multiple times. This is called test, retest, reliability. And what you're going to find is that when people take an IQ test maybe a year or 2 years apart, what you're going to find is that their IQ scores tend to be the same if you measure them with the same test multiple times. And I got Ronique here. Thanks for coming in, Ronique. It was nice talking to you last night. Ronique is a little bit of a cynic, and that's okay, Ronique. I feel you in some ways. Now, I will tell you that whatever IQ tests measure, they measure reliably. What that is, we're going to have to argue about. But I like the way you're thinking, Ronique. I really do. Now, another way, so if you take the test and give the person the test at the same time, there should be a high correlation between their scores, right? So if a person scores high the first time, they should score high the second time. If a person scores low the first time, they should score low the second time. A second way to measure how reliable a test is, you might say, well, if you give a person the same test multiple times, they might score similarly. Because they remember the test questions, and that's a very valid complaint. And so, you know what? There's another way to measure reliability, even if you only give the person the test one time. You know what you can do? You can split the test into halves, and you can correlate the halves with one another. So I could give you a 100-item test, and I could break it down and give you a score for the even items and a score for the odd items. And if that test is reliable, the even items should give me the same score as the odd items do. And that's called split half reliability. And Kristen, I'm not ignoring you. That's a very good point. They're reliable but not accurate. That's exactly what I'm going to argue. They're reliable, but let's question their accuracy. And then the second form of an IQ test is what we call alternate forms. If I give you two different IQ tests, they should both, as long as they're both reliable indicators, they should give you the same IQ score every time. And here's the interesting thing. When you take the IQ test in third grade, in order to get diagnosed, put into the AG class, you actually have to take two IQ tests. The first one is the Woodcock-Johnson, and that's the one they give to all the kids. And if your child scores in the high range of that IQ test, they give you a second test that's designed to measure the top end of the spectrum of IQ even more accurately. So they give you a second IQ test, and your child has to score in the above 90% range on both of those tests to be put into gifted education. And so what they're doing is they're giving you alternate forms that measure the same quality. So if I jump on this bathroom scale and it says I'm 130, I should be able to jump on that other bathroom scale right over there, and it should also give me the same measurement or the same weight. And that's what we call alternate forms reliability. And I will tell you that whatever IQ is, and notice I'm saying whatever IQ is can be reliably measured beginning at the age of 4. So if you're going to complain about IQ tests, do not complain about their reliability. They're pretty reliable. Now, validity. We ask the question, does IQ measure something important? Does it measure intelligence? And there we get into a little bit of a quandary. I'm not sure. Now, there are 3 different ways of thinking about validity. The first is what we call face validity. All right. Now, I didn't mention this, but the first attempt at measuring intelligence was measured by a fellow named Francis Galton. He was an English researcher in the late 18th century. And here was his logic. His logic was intelligence is how fast your brain works. And so what he did was he came up with a reaction time test where people did a bunch of hand-eye coordination tasks. And he thought that the speed with which you could engage in these hand-eye coordination tasks was a measure of your intelligence. So let's say how quickly you could make dots on a piece of paper. Is that a good way to measure intelligence? Does that mean you are smart? What do you think? Does that mean you're smart? Absolutely not. You know why? That doesn't even look like an IQ test. That doesn't even look like it measures intelligence. So really, the first way you can think about the validity of a test is, does it look like it measures what it should measure? We call that face validity. That's the least important form of validity, but it's where we typically start. And so I will tell you that IQ tests, when you take one and it asks you to think or to problem solve, you may go, wow, this sure looks like it measures intelligence. So I would say that IQ tests have pretty good face validity. Now, here's the thing. If a test measures a quality accurately, then that test ought to predict your score on some area that quality requires. Okay? So if I am measuring your math ability, okay, if I'm developing a test to measure math competence, then your score on that math competence test ought to tell me how likely you are to pass a math class. That's what we would call predictive validity. Predictive validity. Does the test predict an outcome that is related to the quality you are trying to measure? Now, here's the deal. IQ tests are predictive in some settings. Your IQ test is a very good predictor of how well you will do in school, especially in elementary school. Students with higher IQs will perform better in school settings than people with low IQs. And that's why we use IQ tests in clinical settings at schools, is because we know that if little Johnny's IQ is in the normal range and little Johnny is failing in school, we know that there's some other problem that must be affecting little Johnny, because decades of research have demonstrated that if you score well on an IQ test, you ought to be able to score well, you ought to be able to do well in school. And in fact, the SAT test, which is a form of an IQ test, is a very good predictor of how likely you are to graduate from college in 5 years. The higher your SAT score, the more likely you are to graduate from college in 5 years. And that's why schools like to use SAT tests to determine entrance into their schools, because they do help them figure out who's going to be able to do the schoolwork. So IQ tests have predictive validity in school settings. Now here's where IQ tests run into a little bit of a problem. IQ tests don't really tell us how successful you are going to be as a human being. Now, we think of intelligence as being one of those qualities that helps us be successful as human beings. If you're you work in car repair, the more clever you are, the better you should be at repairing cars. If you work as a salesperson, we would think that clever people are going to be better salespersons. And what you're going to find is that IQ tests don't work as well outside of academic settings. So IQ tests are very good for predicting achievement in school settings, but not in real world settings. So I'm going to put a question mark right there for predictive validity. And then content validity. If I look at the quality I'm trying to measure, so okay, what is intelligence? And then I look at my test should measure everything that I think intelligence is. So, what is intelligence? Intelligence is your ability to do well in school, but there are other ways to be intelligent. Can somebody tell me what's another way to be intelligent other than being book smart? Other than being book smart, what's another form of intelligence? Right? Being book smart's good. It's very, very good. But what's another way you can be intelligent? I'll wait for an answer here. Da 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 da. What's another way to be intelligent? Common sense, absolutely. And Marie laughs. How many of you met somebody with a lot of book smart who has no common sense, right? How many of you have met somebody who has no book smarts, but has a ton of common sense? John Ramos says practical intelligence. Absolutely. Absolutely. Hold on. Somebody's busting my... get away from me. My freaking... Go away. Okay. My Microsoft Teams is popping up. Common sense. April says musical ability, right? People who are great musicians, street smarts, absolutely. Sounds to me like you folks have been reading ahead, which is great. Here's the deal. IQ tests do not measure your common sense. They do not measure your musical sense. They do not measure your artistic ability. You know what? One of my good friends, we call him Radar. He flunked out of school in 8th grade. He's got dyslexia so bad the dude just cannot read. He can't pass an IQ test. If he took an IQ test, he would probably come up as close to being at the retarded range. But here's the deal. This guy is the most amazing mechanic you have ever seen. He's the kind of guy that actually takes engines and puts them into cars that they don't belong to. He builds these special cars. He does car repair as his day living, and he fixes cars like nobody's business. But he actually outside sort of unique cars. He'll take a car body and put a different, bigger engine in it. And this guy knows more about engine repair than anybody else I've ever met. This guy is gifted at mechanical skills. But if you took an IQ test, you'd think that this guy was intellectually disabled. Is he ignorant? Is this IQ test really measuring this guy's intelligence? Absolutely not. It's missing part of what it means to be intelligent. So I have a question mark, but I actually should probably put a red X, because there are people who have severe questions about whether or not IQ tests really measure intelligence. Okay? So when we think about IQ tests, you know what? IQ tests are the most reliable measurement of something starting at age of 4. Is that really intelligence? Not quite. It's not everything related to intelligence. Exactly, Ronique. There are lots of people who maybe don't fit into the classic analytical intelligence field. And you know what? These people shouldn't be forced to play on the same field that people like me. I score really high on analytical intelligence and IQ tests. I don't know squat about mechanics or auto repair. I couldn't do it. Okay, I am not musical at all. But so I play in my world, which is school, and this is where I excel, right? But it's not fair to make everybody play in my world, to play in the school world. And a lot of people are pushed through the school system and made to feel like a failure because they don't have this specific kind of intelligence. And society, for some reason, has decided that school-related intelligence is the most valuable thing there is. Wrong, wrong, wrong. Don't you ever feel that way. If you're a good student and you score really high in school intelligence, go on, do all the schooling you want. Go get a PhD like Dr. Roddenberry. But if you have another form of intelligence, you should follow that form of intelligence. And that's what last night's webinar was about. We were talking about creativity and other ways of adding value to the world, right? That's why some people say a test is nonsense. Well, IQ tests are useful in determining who can learn calculus and some skills that are very important for becoming medical doctors or astronauts or engineers. So engineers and doctors really need school intelligence, Ronique. So I wouldn't say IQ tests are useless. However, their use is far more limited than people have been led to believe, okay? So IQ is nothing but a number that says how well you'll do in a school setting. All right, now, here's another problem with IQ tests. IQ tests have shown ethnic differences as long as they have been around. Now, I will tell you that when they were developing the first IQ tests, some of the questions showed gender differences. That is, some of the test questions. So when we're making up an IQ test, as the test creator, I get to decide which questions stay in the test and which questions aren't used in the test. So I get to decide which are the good questions. In early IQ test developments, they found that females score better on some questions than males. So they threw those questions out. Well, because they knew that those questions aren't right. If they showed a difference between boys and girls, then those obviously weren't good questions. So they threw those out. But nobody paid attention to those questions that showed ethnic differences. Now, one of the things you're going to find is when you look at average IQ scores, what you're going to see are average differences between different groups of people. So your Asian students are going to have the highest IQ scores on average, followed by your Caucasian students with the second highest IQ scores. And then your Hispanics and your African American IQ scores on average are going to be lower. Now we're talking about average, but I want you to look at these distributions right here. What do you see? There is a ton of overlap between these two groups. And yes, the averages may show a little bit of difference, but there's a lot of similarity in these groups, all right? And so we have to ask the question, what exactly do these differences in average IQ scores mean? Now, we might say that there are fundamental human differences, and I would go, because I think people are a lot more similar than they are different. Or we might suggest that maybe these tests represent some sort of inherent bias in our culture. And there are a lot of people who subscribe to this second view, that IQ tests are really quite biased. And so the question is, we have these IQ tests, they show these biases, so we need to think about these and account for these differences in IQ scores. Because if we're going to use IQ scores as the sole indicator of your value in society, that in a sense is going to suggest that that Asian student is more valuable than me, the Caucasian, or you, the Hispanic, or you, the African American. So what do we do with these differences? Here's the deal. There are two suggestions that people have talked about. The first is that we could design different tests that don't show ethnic differences. Here's the weird thing. The ethnic differences on IQ tests usually occur in the verbal sections of the test. If you'll remember, yesterday on Tuesday, I suggested to you that you have a full scale IQ and you can break that down into your verbal IQ and your nonverbal IQ scores. And where you'll find the differences between ethnicities are more typically on the verbal parts of the IQ test. So there are people who have created tests that don't rely on verbal reasoning. They're all problem solving and logic tests and visual organization tests. And one of these is called the Raven's Matrix. And the Raven's Matrices test is a test that doesn't show ethnic differences. The only problem is school is mostly verbal. And so the Raven's Matrix test doesn't predict school performance. And we need IQ tests that help us in school settings. So we can develop these tests that don't show biases, but they aren't as useful, practically speaking, in helping us figure out who has learning disabilities. Or we could account for these by making judgments, account for these differences based on IQ tests. You folks may have heard that sometimes there are biases against Asian students because they score so much higher than everybody else on SAT tests. And so some schools are limiting the number of Asian students that they let into their school. even though these Asian students are the best students with the best resume and the best grades, but they're not getting into Harvard because there's already too many Asians in Harvard, right? And then on the other hand, you have some minorities who maybe are allowed into a school even though their SAT scores aren't as high as other students who don't get into the school. And people also scream that this is unfair too. Hey, you're giving that African American or that other, that Hispanic student, you're letting them into the school even though my SAT score was higher and I didn't get into this school. And you know what? That's not really fair either. Some people get angry about that too, right? And so what do we do with these IQ tests that show these biases? It's really hard to know. And Ronique brings up a good point. These IQ tests then lead us to have stereotypes about people's intellectual ability. And stereotypes seem to take on a life of their own sometimes and live far longer than they're useful. And in fact, there are some people who suggest that one of the reasons that some minorities don't score as well as other people is because of what we call stereotype threat. If you put a person into a situation where they expect they are going to fail, guess what will happen to that person? They will fail. And it's because they believe the stereotype. And you know what? Caucasians believe the Caucasian stereotypes. African Americans believe African American stereotypes. You know, stereotypes, unfortunately, are very powerful. And just because there's a negative stereotype about you or your group doesn't mean you don't believe it. Unfortunately, stereotypes crawl in under our skin and affect the way we feel about ourselves. So I may believe that I am, because of a stereotype, that I am intellectually superior or physically inferior or whatever. And so stereotypes really have an effect. Now, if you look at this graph right underneath me, this fellow, I think his name was Charles Williams, did a research study, Claude Steele, did a research study where he gave African American and Caucasian students IQ tests. Now, in one condition, he told them it was an IQ test. And look at this. What you're going to see is that the Caucasian students scored much better than the African American students. There's a big difference in the left two bars. He then gave another group of African American and Caucasian students an IQ test, but he didn't tell them it was an IQ test. He said, this is a problem solving and creative thinking test. And what he found was the differences between these two groups went away. And what Claude Steele suggested, what he concluded, was one of the reasons that we're going to get these differences in IQ tests is because beliefs of the students walking into the test really affect their performance. Okay, now, one of the things I will tell you, there are differences in IQ tests. We don't talk about them as much between males and females. What you're going to find in general is that females on average have higher IQ scores than do males. So if you look at these charts, what you're going to find is that female IQ on average is a little bit higher than male IQ. But you know what? You're going to have more males at the extreme than you are females. So while females on average have a higher level of IQ, you're going to find more gifted males than you will find females. And you're going to find more males in the intellectually disabled area than you will find females. So you're going to have more males at the extremes than you are females. But females on general are going to score a little bit higher on average than will males. So this leads us to the question, hey, does an IQ test really measure intelligence? I will tell you, IQ tests were never measured with the idea of measuring intelligence. Alfred Binet was not asked to develop an intelligence test. He was asked to create a test that helped diagnose children having trouble in school. That's all he was asked to do. And for the first 20 or so years, that's what IQ tests were designed for. Long before anybody ever asked the question, hey, what does it mean to be intelligent? right? And so there are a lot of people who question whether or not IQ tests fully measure what it means to be intelligent. Now, there are a lot of different ways of thinking about intelligence. Now, and I'm going to talk about them just a little bit. Now, it turns out that some people have measured what happens to our intellectual abilities as we get older. So one of the things that happens is as we get older, our mind starts functioning less well, right? And if you've ever talked to an older person, they all say, "Man, I'm not as sharp as I used to be." The question was asked, how does people's intelligence change as they get older? And that led to an insight that there are really two kinds of intellectual ability. One is what we'll call crystallized intelligence, and the other is called fluid intelligence. Your crystallized intelligence is your knowledge for facts, Right? I know, right? I agree, Christine, but you're not. You're not. You're actually you. One of the things that happens is as you get older, your mind doesn't work as fast, but you get more clever in using strategies to help yourself. So you become a wise veteran. Maybe I don't think quite as well as I do, but I now have a pad where I write down stuff so I don't forget it. The young kid may be more clever, but he or she's not going to think to write stuff down, right? They're going to just try to use their mind. You use those old, wise veteran strategies, Christine. Now, crystallized intelligence is your knowledge for facts. And what you're going to find, Christine, is that as you get older, as you and I get older, our crystallized intelligence is not going to decrease. What's going to decrease is called our fluid intelligence. Our ability to think fast. Thank you, Christine. You basically guessed the next words out of my mouth. Fluid intelligence is how flexible and how fast your thinking is. And it turns out that that's the part of your intellectual ability which begins to decline in your 50s. Your ability to think fast and your ability to think creatively is going to decrease inflexibly. Your ability to problem solve. That's what's going to change as you get older. So really, the first thing was these people thought was we need to differentiate between what we'll call knowledge and flexibility of thinking. So what does an IQ test measure? It might measure really your knowledge. Does that measure everything related to your intellectual ability? If it doesn't capture the flexibility of your thinking, then no, it doesn't. All right? No. So, but that fluid and crystallized intelligence really wasn't designed as a way of expanding the thought of what it meant to be intelligence. Instead, we have to think about triarchic theory and the multiple intelligence theories. These theories were attempts to expand what it means to be intelligent. So let's think about these two theories in turn. The first is Sternberg's triarchic theory of intelligence, and he was really one of the first ones to try to expand the definition of what it means to be intelligence. Okay? Now, intelligence, according to Sternberg, is a mental activity directed towards purposeful adaptation to, selection, and shaping of real-world environments relative to one's life. That is, your ability to find your place and to create a setting where you can be successful. And so he adopted a more cognitive informational model and argued that intelligence could be explained as our ability to acquire, manipulate, and evaluate information. And he argued really that intelligence is sort of situational. You're not just generally intelligent, but we can think of you as being intelligent over here, but not as intelligent over here. Intelligent in this situation, but maybe not as intelligent in that situation. And he argued that we need to think about intelligence in three different forms. Now, the first is what we'll call analytic intelligence, and that's what an IQ test measures. your academic proficiency, your ability to read, incorporate intellectual information, your ability to do math calculations, your ability to do science and chemistry equations. That's what he would call analytical intelligence. He argues that's only one form of intelligence. Now, earlier, we were talking, Christine mentioned common sense, Ronique mentioned street smarts. He would argue that that's what we call practical intelligence. Practical intelligence is your knowledge related to the environment that you find yourself in. Okay? So, he is right. So, let's say you are in the hospital and your nurse walks in and you say to the nurse, or you ask the nurse, hey, how's my red blood cell count? If your nurse turns to you and says, what's a red blood cell? What are you going to think if your nurse doesn't know what a red blood cell is? I don't know about you, but I'm going to judge that nurse's ability. I'm going to be like, holy cow, this nurse should know that. On the other hand, if you have a plumber out there fixing your hot water heater and you ask your plumber, hey, do you know much about red blood cell counts? And your plumber goes, dude, I don't even know what a red blood cell is. Are you going to judge that plumber's intellectual ability? No, not really, because it's not relative to that plumber's job. And so what Sternberg thought is that depending upon the context or the situation that you find yourself in as an adult, you should have a different area of what we would call practical knowledge, if you will, okay? So plumbers ought to know all the plumbing stuff. Carpenters ought to know all the carpenter stuff. I'm an online teacher, so I better know how to use the internet and computers and technology, right? And so you can think of practical intelligence, knowing what you're supposed to know given your situation. And then he has a third form of intelligence, which he calls creative intelligence, or your ability to be flexible and innovative, especially in new situations. All right? And so if you think about it, this is a really cool, inclusive way to think about intelligence, right? Now, here's the thing. Unfortunately, in order to get into the intelligence game, really what we expect is that you should also have a test, because the IQ people came up with a test, and this test is highly reliable and has some areas where it demonstrates validity. But Sternberg doesn't really have a test that he has validated, that he can point at and say, this measures the triarchic theory of intelligence. So here's a very wonderful theory, but it's not as useful as IQ because we can't use it in society to help us make decisions. All right? Furthermore, scientists don't really think that creativity and practical ability represent innate intelligence. They would argue that creativity and practical intelligence are things that you pick up from your environment. So, Ronique, if you have street smarts, it's not something you were born with. Scientists would say it's something that you learned from your dad and your mom. Okay? And so, really, it may be a better thought of as a learned set of skills rather than something that's innate and in the system. All right? So, we've got the IQ test. It's biased and it doesn't work outside of school. But inside of school, it is very, very useful for helping us make decisions about helping children out on their educational path. On the other hand, we can take Sternberg's theory. It's very creative. It contains a lot of information, but it doesn't have a test that allows us to make decisions. Okay, now this fellow Howard Gardner wrote a book called Frames of Mind, where he said, you know what, we need to really expand the form of intelligence. He said intelligence is any quality that helps the organism be successful in its environment. So if the koala bear knows how to find eucalyptus leaves, that's intelligence for koala bears, right? If the snake knows how to catch rats, that's intelligence for a snake. So he argues that we ought to think about intelligence as anything that allows you to survive and prosper in your environment. Furthermore, he takes this modular approach. Remember, I've been talking about modularity all semester. And he says if you can point to a part in the brain that controls an intellectual ability that is useful to society, we should think of that as a form of intelligence. And so he came up with 7 different abilities that he thinks are forms of intelligence. And he says that these different abilities can be localized to a specific area of the brain. They show a developmental trajectory, that is, they get better as we grow. And if you damage those parts of the brain, those abilities are damaged or go away. And so he says this is a biological theory that is a better and more complete theory of what it means to be intelligent. And so he has these 7 forms really quickly. Linguistic, mathematical, and logistical are your ability to use words, math, and solve logic problems. This is what we would call classic IQ. Just like Sternberg has a little bit of classic IQ in his theory, so does Gardner, because that is a form of intelligence. Doing well in school is a form of intelligence. But then he adds these other things in. He adds spatial orientation. You know what? Some people are better at maps and locating themselves around the world, and some people are very bad at directions. He argues spatial ability is a form of intelligence. I don't know if any of you ever watched Bob Ross on TV. You young folks may not have heard of Bob Ross. He was this hippie guy from the 70s that would get on TV in a half an hour. He would show you how to paint these amazing landscapes. And Bob Ross could paint a painting that was amazing in a half an hour. That is a form of intelligence. He was able to move his body around and use his hands to create beautiful paintings. So he had great bodily kinesthetic intelligence, if you will. Now, some people are gifted musicians, and if you know how to play a musical instrument really well, or you can write songs, that's a form of intelligence. And then if you see down here, and yes, he was amazing, wasn't he, Christine? And then you see down here in green, I have the intrapersonal and interpersonal, which is your ability to manage your emotions and to respond appropriately to other people's emotions. Emotional intelligence is a form of intelligence, right? Have any of you ever met somebody that has a bad temper and can't control their emotions? Man, that really impairs their ability to be successful. And so we can think of intrapersonal and interpersonal intelligence as forms of intellectual ability. Now, here's the deal. There are some criticisms of Gardner's approach. Some people challenge the face validity of his theory. They say that bodily kinesthetic, being able to paint a picture, is not a form of intelligence. It doesn't look like intelligence. Musical ability is not intelligence. It doesn't look like intelligence. So some people would argue that his theory doesn't have face validity. And more importantly, just like Sternberg, he doesn't have a test to measure his theory of intelligence. So I will tell you, which would you rather have? A flawed test called an IQ test that only really works in academic settings, but is very, very useful? Or is it better to think of intelligence in terms of these broad theories that don't really have useful intelligence tests? So that's where we are at with IQ testing right now. It's important. IQ tests are important, but what I want you to take away from this week's lessons, and especially today's lesson, is your IQ score does not determine your value to society. It simply tells us how well you will do in a school setting. Now, before I get out of here, I'm going to mention one final bit of one final theory of intelligence. And these two folks, Salovey and Mayer, actually argued, you know what, let's throw the school stuff out. Really, all we need is emotional intelligence. They argue really the thing that's going to determine whether or not you're successful as a human being is how well you can control your emotions. So there's actually an EQ test that can be used to measure your emotional control and is sort of helpful in determining who's going to be more successful sometimes in adult life. And this measures what we'll call emotional intelligence, or your EQ, not your IQ, but your EQ. All right, we are at 9:54. I have gone over. I did not mean to. Does anybody have any questions before I log off the broadcast? Don't forget, we have webinar tonight at 8 p.m. and your discussion board is also due tonight at 11:59. I would love to see you in webinar if you haven't already been there. And I also would love to see you do the webinar and the discussion board so you can get extra credit this week. Okay? Also, don't forget, there is an exam review tomorrow morning on YouTube at 9 a.m., just like I did for the last exam. It will be a recording if you can't make it at 9 a.m., and your exam is due 11:59 on Sunday p.m. I see Emma T. loved his TV show too. Christine loved his TV show. I'm glad to see we have some Bob Ross fans out there. And remember, Bob Ross said we never make mistakes. We have happy accidents. And I said, wow. You know, the guy was actually an ex-Marine. Did you believe that? That soft-spoken guy was actually an ex-Marine. Who'd have thunk it, right? What will be on the test for this chapter? I will be specific, Christine. Oh, and one of the things for this chapter, I did not cover problem solving at all. So you can completely throw problem solving off of this exam. I covered half of chapter 8. As we move towards the back half of this chapter, I'm going to be a little more selective, and I might talk about half of this chapter and half of this other chapter. I'm just trying to create a nice story for you this semester, if you know what I mean. Is the test going to include, Yanan just asked the question I just answered. No, it is not, Yanan. As a general rule, I do not omit stuff that I am going to put on a test. I don't try to be tricky that way, okay? So just do not worry about the problem-solving stuff, okay? Great, fantastic. Well, I'm going to go ahead and log off. If anybody has any questions, don't hesitate to send me a text or an email. I look forward to seeing you in webinar tonight and in the review session tomorrow morning. Take care and have a great day.